As far as who I'm most anxious to fight, I think it would definitely be Method NA. I have two guildmates in there, Shakib and Lady, so it would be cool to face those guys and see what we can do against them.
Method NA is a good team because they've been playing together for a long time. They are not just practicing for BlizzCon or MDI Cups or anything like that, also in their off time. You see them pushing keys on live, and they just have so much experience under their belt and a lot of game knowledge.
In Sydney, I knew we had very good chances of winning, but I did not think we'd go 3-0 at the finals. That was very surprising.
I don't think that Method NA can beat us once again. It was a one-timer. We slipped up in the final.
I will have to admit, I did not expect to win at spring finals. There are very few times in my life where I've been literally speechless, and that was one where I just spent so little time even like imagining what it would be like to win. It was a very memorable moment and unexpected.
For the first time ever in BlizzCon history, we are about to crown a champion of the MDI in BlizzCon. Are you ready? Now, first we're going to introduce a team that has not dropped a single series thus far at BlizzCon, a team that has been nothing but clutch in the LAN environment. Ladies and gentlemen, make some noise for Method NA! And their opponents have looked darn good today. Not dropping, not a series, not dropping a single map. Yeah, they had a couple of wipes. They bounced back and they still make it not even look close. Ladies and gentlemen, Method EU! And with that, it's time. Ladies and gentlemen, the grand final of BlizzCon 2019 starts right now. It is time to crown our champion. The stage is set. BlizzCon one more time. Are you ready to figure out who our champion is going to be? How the heck do you beat Method EU today, folks? We have the best glowy brains on the desk to try to answer that question. We've seen a little bit from Method NA today. They have looked fantastic, but Method EU, they have just looked nothing but indestructible.
I think it just comes down to consistency. Both of these teams have spent countless hours practicing, putting in all of the hard work, spending as much time as it possibly takes, and they are being rewarded for it by being in this BlizzCon final. I think it just comes down to consistency. Whoever is the most consistent on the day should take home the trophies.
That's kind of been the thing. We've had two really big compliments, one for each of these teams. One's consistency, we've given that to Method EU, and then we said performing absolutely out of their minds at LANs. That one's going to go to Method NA. It doesn't mean that they don't check both of those boxes. That's just the accolade that we've decided to assign to these teams when we're talking about what we think makes them so incredible. Now, when we look at both of those factors, do you think that that tells enough of the story here?
Not at all. I mean, looking at it, talking about it, and how these teams have clashed together constantly, we've got to have a best of five to be able to decide who is going to be taking it on top. And we saw it in the media piece earlier. You know, JV was saying, I didn't really expect us to win the Australia LAN. I didn't really expect us to go 3-0 in that LAN. So you got to know that at BlizzCon, they really want to make sure they know for sure that they're going to be the champions, or whether it's going to be Method EU.
Yeah, I was talking to JB before we actually got everything set up on the stage, and obviously there's a lot of respect between these two teams. Not only are they both going to be representing Method, but they know each other very well. And JB, the first thing they said to me was like, yeah, we want to try to take this all the way to a 5-game series. They want to win, they want to do it in the 3-0, but I think everybody is hoping for a full 5-game series. But we're going to jump down to the floor and see if I has heard any whispers.
Rich, you are totally right. These are two teams that definitely respect each other. Usually these things end in rivalries. However, Method EU and Method NA were back there backstage, hugging it out, wishing each other luck, giving each other advice. And these teams are two great teams that clearly have a lot of respect for each other, as you said. So it's going to be an amazing series, Rich.
Thank you very much for that. And one thing that I also do want to shine a little bit of light on, because we were just talking about how incredible the teams are, let's actually talk about this map pool a little bit. Of course, this is going to be a little bit different than the rest of the MDI action that we've seen today. Best of 5. It's ironic when we look at these maps, how do you think they actually play into what we've seen from these teams so far?
This is a really tough map pool. I know looking at these top 5 map pools, these best of 5, the best 2 maps on this dungeon for Method and A are Motherlode and Freehold. These guys have been lights out on those 2 dungeons. But then you look at Shrine and Waycrest, and we've seen Method EU be fantastic on those 2 as well. I think a lot of what happens in this series is going to come down to what happens in our first map in Atal'Dazar. And I mean, it's kind of hard to say what happens. We saw Method and A have a pretty solid run earlier in the tournament, but it wasn't exactly like, you know, it wasn't something where I'm like, oh, they're 100% ready on that map.
Well, when you say that Method NA looks good at Motherlode, that's a pretty good thing to say, seeing that it's in that 3rd slot, right? So that means that they would at least be able to extend if you are going to favor them in that map. But let's talk about the early maps. Who do you favor in that one, Jack?
I think that's going to be one of the toughest ones because, yes, Motherlode's very favored for Method NA, but we've seen Waycrest Manor for Method EU. When they're playing at their top level, they are unbeatable. So I think Atal'Dazar is going to be one of the toughest ones and probably one of the closest games that we're going to see throughout this series.
Now, we've already mentioned the fact that this is definitely going to be a new page in the history books. It's the first time that we are crowning a champion at a BlizzCon, but there are already some pages in that history book, and these guys, both of these squads, have their names written all over it. I want to start, Tettles, by actually talking about what we saw at the LAN this year.
Yeah, so at the LAN this year, we actually had Method in a 3-0 Method EU in the grand finals, and that could have been done due to a wide variety of things. Maybe there were some like LAN jitters, maybe there were some inconsistencies in what was practiced and what was done. It could just been the momentum that like excelled Method in A into the grand finals, but overall, it just comes down to maybe Method EU will carry this momentum.
I think that they will in a huge way on this one. I remember when we were there day of that LAN, practice was going on before the games got started, and we remember talking to them, and Method EU was just like, something's up today. Something's in the air. We're just not playing good. Our practice was bad before the games today, and it showed in the grand final in Australia, right? Today, they have so much time to be able to work through any of their problems. Like, I remember, very first interview we had with Gingy today, he was like, yeah, I wasn't really happy with my performance at all. He starts fixing it, they start getting better, they start improving over the course of the day, and I think with that momentum, it's going to be going in their favor.
Wasn't happy with this performance with the 2-0.
Yeah, it was like a 2-0, and he's like, yeah, I didn't roll enough 5s or something, you know, whatever.
I woke up pretty early this morning, you know, excited to hear everything with BlizzCon, excited to actually get to the stage and to get to this grand final, and the first person I bumped into was Gingy, and the main thing that he kept saying was the idea of, oh, we're just going to use this into our advantage. We are going to get up on the main stage, make it our home, get relaxed, and just start feeding off the energy of the crowd. And it's ironic we're seeing that.
I mean, they've done that about as perfectly as you can. 3 straight 2-0s. They've looked fantastic in all of them. Minus a couple small wipes, but the way they've come back in those dungeons where they had problems, I mean, it makes me scared for any other team, especially Method and A, just to see how strong Method EU is. Even if they have a problem, which would break another team, they seem to come back and play even better afterwards.
I think that was one of the main highlights of the day. You start in that shrine, and you see on the first boss they need to go for a full reset. Adds a lot of time onto the clock. They still come back to win it. But that wasn't it. We saw an early wipe come out in a dungeon a little bit later, and they come back with an incredible time. When you look at Method NA, though, I want to say, flip side of the coin, we say that Method EU's all hot and ready. They've been able to just get 3 series under their belt before they even got to the grand final. Is there any chance that Method NA is cold here, Tettles?
I mean, I guess there potentially could be a chance that Method NA was cold. We saw in their first match against Abracadabra, they came out pretty hot, though. It's just about being able to capitalize on mistakes and making proactive plays. Overall, I feel like Method NA can definitely capitalize on those mistakes, and they can make proactive plays of their own, make some really excellent routing choices that will allow them to be able to take some matches.
And now we get to jump into it. It is time to kick off our grand final. Atal going to be the first place where it goes down. Who's going to be able to get that early win? Will it be Method NA or Method EU? We find out right now.
Atal'Dazar is the map. Game number 1 between Method EU and Method NA. Both going into the left side here, approaching AWZ's room, and we've seen this time and time again, Zyronic. Some big pulls and some big action on this one.
And it's all about making sure you get those snaps perfectly set here. And as long as they do that, this pull's going to be totally fine. But I want to go back to something about JB. I very specifically remember him saying the biggest problem that he always had with Method EU, oh, never mind.
We got another big problem right now.
This is terrible. Getting a Confessor once off his mantle off is the worst thing you can possibly do because you can't interrupt any casts. It's the same as that Tides Emissary.
There's 2 right now. There's 2, and they're having any of the Juggernauts running all over the place. The entire team dropping very low. Last of the defensives getting used, but the wipe is coming up for Method EU as the last vestiges of the team are getting taken down.
Whereas on the side of Method NA, they totally pulled it off just fine. No deaths. They even have time left on their bloodlust for the next pull, and they've already got the snap prepared. They're just trucking on in the dungeon, whereas Method EU didn't get any of the trash down. They're at 0%. The one saving grace for them is they still have the bloodlust available.
And they still have their Army of the Dead as well. I think they just knew something was wrong. Something was up, and they just weren't able to execute properly onto that one. And they just decided that they were going to be able to, once that kick went up, they just decided they were going to have that wipe, and then decided it'd be better to reset.
And of course, I mean, the thing is, we know they're saving their bloodlust for this Colossus pull because this is something that they really have to make sure that they get perfect single target damage on the Colossus. And you can see Method NA is doing a fantastic job of doing that without the bloodlust. So these guys, I mean, I said I wasn't too sold on whether or not they were going to be good in Atal'Dazar, but they seem like they're right at home here.
That's right. I mean, and they should be for that matter. I mean, this was one of the early dungeons that they had to go through in order to be in the position that they're in right now. I mean, they were playing it day 1 against Team D, so it had to be one of those dungeons they would be comfortable with, be ready to be able to play on, and wanted to be able to burn through it as quickly as they could because they wanted that upper seeding position, which they got.
And it looks like they got that Juggernaut a little bit high on the side of Method NA, but they were able to focus single target it down to have the final 3 mobs die at pretty much the exact same time. Exactly what you would want to do in this bolstering setting. Perfect execution from them. And we're going to see them quickly moving on to Priestess AWZ's room as Method E was just now finishing up that first pull. And it wasn't even the full first pull. They had the 3 mobs CC'd off on the side.
Yeah, they had to split it in half. They still got Bloodlust. They still got a lot of their major cooldowns at their disposal. So I'm kind of surprised that they didn't end up trying to double up a little bit more, whether it was grabbing those 3 mobs or going back into the usual pull. But sometimes if you just don't have enough damage, it poses even greater risks. While Method NA is just getting themselves in prime position to take on AWZ. They delayed the caster, they delayed the entry of the Enchanted Emissary into the group. JV's just sitting out at range, so the Juggernaut will be running over to him, and they'll be able to have stuns to shut him down, and then they'll be ready to go with Priestess AWZ.
And I mean, this isn't exact. I mean, looking at this wipe from Method EU, we've seen them overcome this twice today already. Early wipe into somehow just being so much faster than the other team. But can they do that with Method NA, who's the only team to have beaten them in a series in this tournament? I don't know if it's going to be enough for them. And they're actually opting to completely skip that snap spot that we saw that Method NA pulled. They're not pulling the Colossus at all.
This could be incredibly interesting. I'm wondering where else they're going to be making up for more trash, because the Colossi was one that we were always seeing out of a number of different teams here. And I think it's likely we're going to start looking at both the pack at the bottom of the stairs being pulled in with Priestess AWZ for both teams at some point. But when you're skipping that entire Colossi pack, I'm very curious to see where they're going to make up for the extra percentage.
I mean, that's very curious. I mean, that's pretty much what the emergent best strata come through from Atal'Dazar through this entire year of, cause and effect trials from all these teams practicing Atal'Dazar. I mean, usually what we'll see is teams go to the bottom of the stairs, like you mentioned, pull that pack on top of AWZ because it does percentage boss damage. They don't have to worry about the bolstering, but it looks like Method NA isn't even doing that. And no, they just got it. They just got it. So it's just on stage. They're just going to go ahead and start AoEing this trash pack down while not worrying about boss damage because those transfusion casts are going to deal with the rest of the boss for them.
That's right. They just got to get another 25% of the boss's HP down. It shouldn't be too much of an issue on that end. And by the time they're killing it all off, yeah, there's a lot of damage going out into the group, but as long as that Trank is going to be able to top everybody off, Lighty's so low right now, 2%. Grievous is stacking up to full. This is full emergency mode for JV right now. They need to be able to stay alive. Priest AWZ at 3%, but Nerf goes down. Nerf does go down. Lighty goes down. They get the battle res up. They need to taunt AWZ and get her under control. 2 more mobs still left onto the boss. Another death on the side for Shakib, and this Atal'Dazar's getting bloody. She's gonna heal! She's gonna heal! AWZ does survive! Nerf goes down! Method EU back in the driver's seat.
Man, that is so unfortunate. I mean, all they had to do was get in the blood pools at the end there, and they would have finished the boss off, even at 2%, and they weren't able to do it. Now they have to go back and deal with the entire boss again, and they have to single target the entire boss because they don't have anything to cleave on top.
If there was any, I didn't think it was possible to have an even more grievous wipe than Method EU had at the beginning, but Method NA just did on that one. This is going to be incredibly tough for them to be able to bounce back from that one. It's a full boss ahead.
I mean, that's worst case scenario. Wiping out a boss at 1%, you lose so much time doing that. And I mean, like you mentioned, even though Method EU had that awful first wipe, they're now back in the driver's seat because Method NA just has to deal with an entire single target boss. Even though this is a fortified setting, the boss doesn't have buffed health, it's just so much time loss. I mean, this is going to be rough for Method NA.
It really will be. I mean, you're still relying on having 2 or 3 transfusion casts going off from AWZ in order to bring her down. That, the added risks, I mean, it just seemed like Nerf decided not to kite or didn't want to run around and have the honor guards start slaying anybody else from those heroic strikes. Whatever the case was, it was incredibly unfortunate. It's going to cost them quite a bit. And when we look at Method EU, we rarely see them make mistakes more than once.
I mean,
counting on them to be able to make another mistake to give the advantage back to Method NA is going to be a tall order.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these guys, whenever we've seen them make mistakes in a dungeon, they've literally only done it once, and then they were lights out afterwards. So we know Method NA is going to have something up their sleeve, unless Method EU somehow decides to change the way they've been playing all day. They have to come up with something in this dungeon. They have to have something in their back pocket in order to come back and have a chance of taking this first map.
That's right. I mean, there's going to be some differences out there in terms of the routing as well, since Method EU still has a difference between the Colossi with Method NA. So maybe there's going to be some differences. Maybe there's going to be some more risks. We did see some of our offline matches. If I'm not mistaken, it was Abracadabra having some pretty crazy pulls with the Void Emissary near Volcall.
Yeah, on that right side, they pulled a bunch of the honor guards on top of a Void Emissary, which is something we never see teams do. I believe the only time we saw it was from 40K, and I believe the 3rd West Cup last season. And when we saw them do it, we were so confused. You don't pull the honor guards. They do too much damage. It actually caused a wipe for them or multiple deaths, but they pulled it off just fine at BlizzCon, and the double unholy DKs allow it.
That's true, it really does. And we'll have to look at where they're going to start making those differences, because it is a very open dungeon with a lot of options at our disposal. So Razan going down, 10% HP for Method EU, as Method NA got AWZ down, and now they're trying to work on some of these trash mobs, making sure they're going to be in the right position for Razan.
You have to just snap it, doing some of those sword snap pulls that we see so often in this dungeon, making sure they're AoEing on top of that singular point. And of course, they snap the Sky Screamer down to deal with it on Razan, so they're not single targeting the entire time. But you can just see how far behind they are at this point. Even though they have that extra 9% or so trash over Method EU, they have almost an entire boss to deal with.
They do indeed. But that was an incredibly interesting pull that we saw at a Nerf. He grabbed the Sky Screamer, and then as the rest of his team was already waiting below the stairs, somebody placed a flag, a racing flag down, and he was able to charge to it or intervene to it, which then made the Sky Screamer instantly snap into position, rather than having to try to go down the stairs all the way and be susceptible to evading. That was incredible.
I mean, just tiny little optimizations every single time. And here's this big pull we were talking about. They're pulling Shield Bearers of Zul, which you don't normally want to pull. And actually, it looks like they're not going to be pulling with the Void Emissary until we just start denying it again. There we go. And this is such a scary pull, but you saw that Honor Guard paralyzed on the side. They're not dealing with that massive AoE damage.
That's right. They skipped both of the Honor Guards in this area. Xaylia used his Ring of Peace in order to split 2 Shield Bearers off from a pack a little bit further down the path, and they brought all of it into that Void Emissary, and they're just absolutely annihilating this trash pack, trying to gain another advantage. We talked about it. We're like, oh, I don't really like this pull when we saw it previously in the end of the regular season, but they've optimized this one to a T.
This reminds me a lot of the original Atal'Dazar strategies, because I remember we had that as one of our time trial dungeons early on, and I remember Dr. J saying, oh, you don't pull any of the honor guards, and I mean, this reminds me a lot of those initial strategies, except they're doing it kind of the opposite way. Of course, now what they can do, since they're still in combat with those honor guards, should they choose to, they can just run through everything in Shadow Meld, but they're not even going to do that. They're just going to get the rest of their trash count right here. This is what they're going to use to make up that Colossus pull.
They are indeed, and I guess whenever you have so many of these Bulwark of Jujus out, if you have enough crowd controls out at your disposal, they're just kind of picking and choosing. This is like the buffet style for dungeons right now, with Shadow Meld at their disposal, with hard crowd controls from any of the blinds, from any of the paralysis or anything like that. They're able to get in combat with a lot of these mobs, bolster the absolute unholiness out of them, and then just run into a Vokal's room, shadow meld, and they're totally fine.
I'm pretty sure I just saw one of the DKs control undead one of those honor guards. Yep, you can see it right there in the front of the pack. They're using that for a little extra damage on this pack.
It's just another way of controlling it, though, because
damage,
if they were going to actually take care of it full time, they would need to make sure that it doesn't ever get bolstered. So they're probably going to let it go, let it do its own thing. He's sending it away right now. That way they can run away, drop their control of it, and then shadow meld.
I mean, yeah, it's just a little bit of extra damage for them. That thing does so much damage. But I guess it wasn't actually procced yet. It wasn't doing its massive AoE damage. It's just, like you mentioned, an extra way for them to crowd control it. But the shadow meld comes in. They're onto Vokal, the third boss of the dungeon for Method EU. And these guys, I mean, it's a new strategy we've seen. It's a new pathing, but it looks like they're pulling it off perfectly.
They really are. But keep in mind, let's not count out Method NA just yet, because they are equal in terms of trash percentage, and they're taking on even more right now, as they do have Bloodlust at their disposal as they're getting closer to Vokal's side. But keep in mind, Nerf's dropping really low. We're going to have to keep an eye on him here, as that Sky Screamer does get paired up with a number of those Saurons, and he does go down. It looks like Method NA might be having another wipe right now.
I mean, this is just worst case scenario for them. 2 full team wipes in the first map of a series. You got to keep your mentality in check here. That's really all I can think for them right now, because in their minds, with 2 full team wipes against Method EU, a team that's been so consistent all day, there's no way you're winning this dungeon. But they just have to keep going through the motions, just on that off chance that something's going wrong.
I think if they're able to pull some larger setups, they would have been able to get back into a more favorable position, because the death differential wasn't that bad. But having the crowd control break on that Sky Scream was just so debilitating for the team. And it looks like somehow they did end up getting the Emissary of the Tides. Okay, it was on purpose that they got the Emissary of the Tides onto the group. So the setup was just broken because of the fact that they did not crowd control the Sky Screamer properly. They ended up trying to put the paralysis onto the Sky Screamer before the Tide's Emissary was in and away from it. The CC broke, Sky Screamer snapped into position, AoE'd everybody and feared them.
Second time the charm for them. They pulled that same trash pull that they just wiped on. Looks like everything's going just fine for them this time around. Meanwhile, Method EU, while we've been talking about Method NA, Method EU has just kind of dealt with the entire third boss of the dungeon. They've got Vokal down to 20%. Now, usually at this point, teams have finished off all of their trash percentage, but Method EU still has to deal with a bunch of the dungeon.
They really do at this point, and they're going to be another boss behind as they're grabbing a ton of Sky Screamers. We'll see if they're pulling the full 5 that we saw earlier and start having those hibernate spam we saw out of the Druids, just making it so they can completely shut down one more mob and make everybody's life a little bit easier.
Looks like they're only going for 4, it seems. The hibernate theme, I've really only ever seen Buff War and Nerf Rogue do that, and of course they did it again here, but denying your Druid the damage there, I'm not quite sure that's 100% the best strategy, but man, it does look flashy when they do it.
It really does look flashy, and you're right. It does take up a lot of extra activity time. You have to make sure nobody's taking any other kind of damage, and it's sort of an odd and too much of a scalpel, too fancy of a pull to be very consistent.
Yeah, a little bit too glowy-brained, I think. But yeah, Method EU, they're probably just going to go straight through the rest of the trash that we just saw Method NA deal with, as they now head up to Vokal, while both teams are dealing with the same trash pack at the same time, just from different directions here. How about that?
That's right, but 1 boss difference, 6 death difference as well. Zelia dropping pretty low, and they've been dealing very well with Grievous from what we've been seeing so far.
I mean, and he does have that staff proc available in about 30 seconds there, but I mean, he's not going to have any major time to actually build up any stacks. It's not going to be that big of an issue for them. So, Method EU, they're looking good after that wipe again. It looks like they're going to get away with it for a 3rd time today.
It really, I mean, but
with some help from Method.
Yeah, I was going to say, to be fair, it was off the back of some wipes from Method NA. Some of the other series that we saw, it was just like, oh, that team had like 1 death, or they got a little bit slower pulls. Their routing wasn't as good, and then Method EU was able to capitalize. But here, they are firmly in the driver's seat, as they even grab the Emissary of the Tides, and they do still have that Sky Screamer, who's crowd control just behind it. So, sorry, it is parried. They're not in combat with it, and they don't have to worry.
It's just out of range of the Emissary of the Tides. I believe it's about a 10-yard range, so they have plenty of time, plenty of room there to make sure they're not dealing with any of that. They still do need to deal with, I believe, 1 more Sky Screamer just to finish off their trash percentage. They'll probably end up doing that after the boss or with the boss just to finish it off for their last percentage. But we see Method EU moving up to the final boss of the dungeon in a commanding position.
They really are on this one. And for a dungeon that started with disaster, they are in a prime position to be able to take a game number 1, which we were talking about how important it is for both of these teams to be able to get an early lead and an early advantage, and making sure when you're in the grand finals, you're not letting any nerves get to you.
Yeah, but the question for me is, where's that extra 2.5% coming from? Are they going to go down afterwards to deal with it? Oh, I mean, it's oh, there it is right now. Just now come up. Hey, there it is. Hey.
He had to walk a little bit of ways, all right, but he made the journey.
But the question is, they're going to have to CC it off on the side, because what they don't want to happen is they don't want to kill it while the boss is still in a high percentage. This is a bolstering dungeon, and you don't want to bolster a boss, give it that much extra HP. So either they're just going to not cleave it at all, and they're going to go ahead and cleave, move around with it in the group just to get a little bit of extra passive cleave on it, which looks like what they're doing. Normally we'd see teams just opt to CC that off on the side, but they're just so confident in their strategy that they're going to leave it in the group.
I mean, at this point, they might as well. I mean, there's too many risks at this point when they've got the game well in hand, and they just need to make sure, hey, we're not offering any extra damage that we shouldn't be dealing to it. We're staying well to keep everybody up together and making sure the kicks are everything that we need. And I love the control out of both of these Unholy DKs. You have the grips, you have a longer range on your kick, and you even have the pet kick as well that you can start taking advantage of if you really needed it on top. And Method EU, despite that early wipe, just like the wipes that we've seen in 2 other series beforehand, they're able to shake it off and they're able to bounce back.
And I mean, Method EU, the second this boss and this Skyscraper go down are going to be taking game 1 of the series, there's absolutely nothing that could possibly go wrong for them.
The Zyronic curse onto that one. 3% left onto Yasma. The Skyscraper has gone down, and so has Yasma. Game number 1 going to Method EU.
Shinji letting out a roar there, and if you watched them today, you would say that nobody could beat them, right? There's one team that's been able to take them down in this tournament and actually knock them down to the slower side of the bracket. You have to keep that in mind. They are going up against their toughest competition. These are by far the 2 top dogs in this tournament, but how on earth, Tettles, did Method EU find themselves in this situation in this map?
I mean, overall, Method EU found themselves in the situation on this map just because of this first pull and how bad it actually ended up being for them, just because of those mantles going off, making all those mobs no longer be able to be kicked or anything. And then Method NA just decided that it was time to also have a mistake right at the very end of Priestess Alunza. Nerf ends up going down. You see that Spirit of Gold is actually collecting all of those puddles because they expected to be able to have enough damage to be able to beat that transfusion cast. Priestess Alunza begins healing, whereas on the side of Method EU, they are already killing Priestess Alunza just a few seconds after. And then there was actually pretty interesting pathing discrepancies between the 2 teams, but overall, they were really neck and neck, but basically Method NA lost because of the Priestess Alunza wipe, and then they also have a pretty big wipe to the Sarids towards the very end. The Sarids, whenever you are in this bolstering environment, are fairly dangerous. JB going down just due to, I don't actually know precisely what happened. Maybe he got feared, maybe he just ended up dying to some incidental damage from Sarids coming out of the snap spot or something like that. But overall, pretty good showing for Method EU, even with a minor blunder at the very beginning.
I mean, it seems like Method EU almost enjoys having minor blunders at the beginning of dungeons and then just coming out and looking absolutely excellent. This is the 3rd dungeon where we've seen them have, whether it is a wipe or needing to have that reset when they were actually enshrined, they're not fazed by it. I think Zyronic, when we talked about Method NA being one of these teams that's very clutch in the LAN environment, I think Method EU's been the embodiment of that throughout this tournament.
I mean, absolutely. They definitely have been. They've been so clutch, and even in situations where they've been making mistakes. But Method NA, I feel like Atal'Dazar just has to be a problem dungeon for them. We've seen them so many times in Cups have these perfect runs, just one minor mistake costs them an entire pull. They end up wiping, and it costs them the dungeon. I just don't know if that's one of their best dungeons.
Would you agree with that, Jack? Do you think that Atal might be a pressure point?
I think it's one of the dungeons they're definitely in like a moderate level of comfortability with. I mean, we've seen how well they've done for like with Motherload and with Freehold, for example. Those are like really the big bread and butter for them. But Atal'Dazar, especially when you have to deal with bolstering, when you have to start adjusting some of your routes in a particular way, I think that definitely does mess with Method NA.
Well, it's a rematch right now, Method versus Method. This one for all the marbles. When we return, we're going to do the work and determine who is your champion.